Hi, everybody. I'm so excited to be here today. We're going to do something different, a bit of an exploration. I don't have any slides, so a little bit nerve-wracking, but I'm going to show you how I work and how I debug web pages and components for accessibility. And the main idea that I want you to take away is that there's people out there who need accessibility to live more independent and productive lives. People with disabilities often can't use the apps and the components that we're building. So I'm hoping to teach you some technical skills rooted in empathy, so you can actually make a difference out there, because you can. You can make things more accessible with a bit more know-how and some empathy. My entire talk today is based in a repository. So on my GitHub, I have a repo called Empathy-Driven Development. It has a broken web application, a series of components that I've built that are similar to things you might see out there on the web. And we're going to work on fixing those components today. So if you want to follow along with the fixes, I have tagged them in Git, and they are listed in the README. So to start things off, I'm going to just talk about what components we're going to look at. We'll go look at them in their broken state, and then through the talk, we will improve them as things go on. So the first component is a login form, which is pretty basic, but somehow we get that wrong. There's also a card flip component, which if you've looked at the Uphill Conf website, might look a little bit familiar. And it's a common component, so let's look at how we can fix it for keyboard users and screen reader users. And then in single-page apps, oftentimes when we're changing routing and changing views, a screen reader user who's blind might have no idea that things are changing. So we're going to implement more accessible title changes in our single-page app so that a screen reader user can follow along. Now, we're not going to get to everything. A bit of a disclaimer. There's a lot that we could do, but in this short amount of time, we'll do a few things that I think are really common problems that can really improve the accessibility of your app. But we won't get to all of it. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter. I love talking about accessibility. It's something I care a lot about, especially technical accessibility. So why are we talking about this? Well, really, there's so many different kinds of people out there, and not everyone can see the screen or use a mouse or a trackpad. Some people need a bit more time. We can't have things flashing and changing quickly without adequate controls and buttons to give people ways to navigate through our applications. In a really broad sense, you could say that 15% of the world's population have some kind of disability. People who are aging and can't see very well or can't hear very well. People who have one arm or are blind. And so by not including accessibility, we're often leaving these people behind. And if you don't think that applies to you, things can change in an instant. I have friends that ride mountain bikes, and boom, they get in an accident, and they're either paralyzed or really close to it. So even if you think it might not be something that applies to you or your audience, that can change really fast. So we don't want to leave people behind. You also don't need to reinvent the wheel. A lot of patterns that we implement on web pages have already been considered for accessibility. So with tools like the ARIA Authoring Practices Guide, I have some links in my README for beginning accessibility, really the basics, so that even if we can't touch on all of it today, you can go through these resources and learn more about accessibility. There's a couple of online courses you could take. I have one on Egghead. There's one on Udacity from the Chrome team. There's lots of resources out there. So if this piques your interest, hopefully I can open the door to accessibility for you, and you can realize how big of an impact you can actually make. Because often all it takes is one champion at a company to get everyone caring more. Just a couple days ago, someone said, yeah, there's one core developer on our team who cares a lot about accessibility, and he gets us all excited about it. So all it takes is one person sometimes to make a difference. We also want to make sure we're not just focused on code, that we're testing our apps with real people, including people with disabilities. So I have some links on how to test, how to include people with disabilities in your usability testing, which, usability testing, anyone? We need more of that for sure. So there's some tools in this app that I'm going to uncover throughout the talk, but we're really just going to look at an app and diagnose accessibility problems. That's the bulk of what we're doing today. So with that, let's go over to the browser. And I have a very simple component library that I'll be adding to over time. So it's just 2 components right now. There's a third that doesn't really, it's a component that isn't a very visual one, so there's nothing to really see. But we're going to look at 3 components today. A login form, we'll look at this card flip component, and then we'll implement the accessible title change in our single page app. So this is written in React. Really, these concepts apply to any web page, or you might not even be using a JavaScript framework. So a lot of these concepts are core fundamentals that we don't learn in school or in boot camps. So hopefully you will learn some more things today. So in our component library, we can go look at the login form, and it's pretty simple. It just has 3 fields in it. They have placeholders, so no visual labels. There's a submit button. So we're going to look at that. We'll look at our little card flip. So speaking of dogs, this is my little fella. His name is Rainier McChetterton. And so, you know, why shouldn't he have a profile? He's important little guy. And if I hover over this with the mouse, it opens up his bio, which, by the way, does anyone know that there's a doggo ipsum, lorem ipsum generator? I didn't think we needed any more lorem ipsum generators, but I found one that was built like in 2017 or 2018, and I'm like, wow, they actually found the one lorem ipsum generator that we really needed. So this is a little overlay that might look familiar, but there's some issues here. Like if I can't use a mouse or a trackpad, I can't even get to this content, or I can't interact with it. So to make it more equitable and more accessible, it should work with the keyboard, right? Well, it doesn't right now. So we're going to look at those components. I'm going to show you how I would debug an application like this. So if we go back to our code, and also part of this talk, I am a new user of Visual Studio Code. So I really like this IDE because I can preview Markdown. I can use a command line interface right in the IDE. See my tags I've been playing with. So I can do a lot of things right in my development environment, including automated testing. So I've got some tests already written, a little bit of a tour through this application. I have a source directory that has components and some assets. I have an app.js file, which is sort of the command center of everything coming together. And then I have both integration tests and some unit tests. So depending on what kind of code you're writing, it's so nice to have automated tests, because if you break something or your team breaks something, you know about it. And often my way of working is, okay, a bug was found. I'm going to go write a failing test, and then when I fix it, I'll sleep better at night knowing that I've captured that in a test, so if it surfaces again, it'll fail. And you're always test suites grow over time, always trying to add new test cases, add tests that cover features of your app, the ways that it should work. And guess what? Accessibility fits great into that, especially if some team members know more about accessibility than others. If you bake that into your automated tests, you can have a contract of how your app should work so other teammates can learn, oh, this component's supposed to work with the arrow keys or close with the escape key. Those are tests that you could write that would then capture that functionality, and if someone breaks it, you can like fire a Nerf gun at them automatically or have a red light light up over their desk if they break CI or something like that. So it really helps to build more robust applications if you can have automated testing. So the first test I'm going to run is an integration test. So I'm going to go into my terminal and type npm run integration. So I have Selenium WebDriver. You could also use Cypress. That's another great integration testing tool. But I'm going to let that run. It's going to open my browser in the background. So I'm actually not able to show you. Let's run that again so we can see Selenium opens a real browser instance in the background, which is more like what a user would experience. So if you're going to write any tests, it's probably good to start with integration tests because it's sort of framework independent. The tests can be more portable, and you're testing components together rather than isolated things where maybe you're mocking network dependencies or things like that. In an integration test, you can go run a set of tests on a real web page. So I have some tests for my home page and for my login page. And there's some issues here that I'm actually using. We'll go look at the test in a second. I'm using a tool called AxeCore, which is an accessibility testing library that I work on. In Simona's talk, she mentioned accessibility in Lighthouse. AxeCore is the API that Lighthouse uses. That's what I happen to work on. There are some other accessibility testing APIs, but the idea is that you can pull an accessibility API into your tests that you're not having to write boilerplate things like labeling. Accessible naming can get a little complicated, or color contrast. You probably don't want to have to write those core tests yourself, so pulling in an API like AxeCore just gets you up and running faster. So in our integration test, it found that our homepage doesn't have a main landmark. So that's kind of an issue for a screen reader user in that there's no hook for them to navigate to the main section of our content. On our login page, it also found that those inputs were not labeled. So that's kind of a bummer. So a screen reader user wouldn't be able to identify what those inputs are for. And this might seem super basic, but sadly, it's so common because it's easy to forget. Let's go look at what that component looks like. So I've got a login form component. I just pass it an array of field names. It could definitely be more robust. But each input field is just an input type of text. It's got a placeholder, which there's two problems with that. The labels aren't there, so a screen reader user, depending on what browser they're in and what assistive technology, they don't know what to type in the field. Also, placeholders, I don't know about you, but the second you start typing and you don't know what the field is anymore, like if we go back to our browser, let's go to our form. The second I start typing my name, like if it was a telephone number or a specific date format, without a label outside of the field, I can't tell you how many times I have to delete what I was typing and figure out what field I'm in again. So placeholder is not the best. You shouldn't rely on that for labeling a field. So to fix this, it's a pretty simple change, although you might have to convince your design team to actually have a visible label. But I'm just going to type a label, if I can spell it correctly. The label element, it will wrap our input field, and I'm going to add some visible text. So I've got this in my React component. I've got the name. I'm iterating over an array. So I can just go and grab the name of the field that I was passing into this component. I'm actually going to get rid of the placeholder because it's redundant. Maybe you could add a placeholder that's talks more about the format or something. I'm going to change this to make the label visible. One other thing we could do is in our form, so we were in the individual fields that will get iterated over and produced on the screen, but this login form has a headline in it. It says, enter your personal details. Well, that's nice, it's a heading, but in a form you can actually expose what the form is for or a group of fields using a legend, a bit more web standards-based way of marking up a form. So I'm just going to wrap our heading that we've already got in a legend. That's something you can actually do in HTML. You can put other elements inside of the legend. Unlike a label, you can't put a heading in a label. So now our form is looking a little bit better. If we open up our tests again, I'm going to run npm run integration. It's going to run those two sets of tests. Our login page is looking better. Before we had all of those labeling errors. So we fixed those. We're still missing a main landmark. So let's go look at that real quick. In our app, I've got a header element wrapping the H1, which links to the home page, and then I have a list of components. Pretty common to have navigation in a header element. Well, I happen to use a div with a class name of main, but isn't there a more semantic way that I could do that? Well, this is a pretty easy change. I can just change a div to the main element. And what that does is both the header and the main elements implicitly offer a role. So when a screen reader user lands on any of these elements, it will be announced as a header or a main element. It's like a different way of navigating. If you're using a screen reader, you sort of have this superpower where you can navigate chunks of content, which is helpful when you can't see the screen, because you can't just move your mouse cursor to that area. So you need other ways to jump around. And the main element, I forgot. So let's go run our tests one more time, see if these are passing. So we fixed the labeling issue. We added a legend just for funsies. And now we've got that main element that's working better. So our integration tests are pretty simple. This is just the things that Axe Core was finding. So some really common, like low-hanging fruit sort of things. Once you do that, you've got a really great baseline for accessibility if you can fix a lot of these issues. But there's some issues that can't be caught by an automated testing tool like Axe Core, things like keyboard support or the lack thereof. So let's go back to our card flip component. So this one works by the mouse, but a keyboard user can't get to this thing. So let's inspect this markup a little bit and see what it looks like. Make my DevTools a little bit bigger. So it's just a series of divs. It has an image. The image has an alt attribute that's empty, which is nice because then the screen reader user, it's debatable whether we want to add real alt text to this. You at least need, like if it's decorative and doesn't really provide any information that the user would benefit from, I can leave the alt attribute empty. And then the file name isn't read. Which, I mean, even this example in my Create React app, it's kind of adding a cacheable file name to my image. I mean, can you imagine being in a screen reader and having it read like your auto-generated file names? Like the way that we create files and distribute them on the web is a little different than in like the publishing days where your file names were indicative of your like file system, and maybe if you were a photographer, your file names would have been okay. Like that's why it works that way. But these days, we need to be more careful about how we label things beyond just the way that an app looks. So for this, we need something more interactive, like other than a div, something like maybe a button. That'd be kind of cool. So what we would do is, instead of just putting a hover state on a div, we need to have something keyboard interactive, like a button. And then what that will do is, instead of just showing a div, we're going to need some sort of a sibling element that we can like layer on top. So we're going to switch our context as a keyboard user from the button to this overlay and back and forth. It's almost like a modal window, but like a little tiny version. So if we go back to our code, I'm going to get out of our integration tests. So let's do a little bit of a tour of what this stuff looks like. So we fixed the login form. I'm going to close that stuff. So our card flip, it is a React component. It's got some, instead of using CSS, I use some JavaScript so I can actually test that events are happening. Sort of hard to test CSS hover states. I'd love to talk to you. If you have like automated tests for CSS things, let's chat, because I'm curious about how you do that. At least we can use some JavaScript here to mimic what was happening in the real life version of this component. So it's got an on-mouse enter and an on-mouse leave, which, sure, you can do that on any div, but a keyboard user gets nothing. So everything in this component is just visible by default, but it's not interactive for a keyboard or a screen reader user. So we've got a series of divs. There's an H5 for the name, which that heading level, you want to check your kind of overall page and see, do my heading levels make sense? Does it make a hierarchy? Or are we just skipping around, going from H2 to H5? You want them to go in order. So we've got a link in there for a Twitter link, and then we've got, like the H5 is sort of duplicated down below. So we've got the normal state and then the overlay state. So this thing, we could make it better. I've got some unit tests for this that I sort of stub this component, pass it some fake data. Trivia here. My dog is named Rainier McChetterton, but his alternate name, if I didn't name him that, was Sir Humphrey Beauregard. Didn't go with it, but I can put it into my little unit test here. So I've got some tests for the active state, so I can test that if I, rather than actually hovering on the thing, I can just set the active state and that it should update the UI accordingly. Your methodology for unit versus integration testing, it's sort of a blurry line, like how far do you go into DOM testing in unit test land? sort of beyond the scope of what we're going to talk about today. But you do want automated tests to make sure your components are reacting to how the user is using your thing. And in this case, we're just doing it from changing the state. In an integration test, you'd probably actually have a hover state, like fire off an event and then see that it does the same thing. I've got some keyboard mechanics that is currently, we'll see it fail because I've written the test for it, but I haven't added the fix yet. So empathy-driven development is sort of a play on words with test-driven development, where you write a failing test, you go add the fix, get the test passing. So we've got a failing test we're going to run in a second. And then I'm using Axcore here to do some accessibility API testing like we did in our integration tests. You can choose whether you want to use Axcore in unit tests or integration tests. It does add a little bit of time. It slows your tests down a little bit, which is why we often recommend integration tests instead. But it is possible. Two sort of gotchas with using Axcore in Jest, which is the test framework I'm using, is that I've turned off color contrast and a rule called link in text block, which actually uses color contrast under the hood. And that's because JS-DOM, the renderer in Jest, does not implement some of the APIs needed to run those tests. So just because that's not going to work, I've turned those off. And then it's basically the same results that we saw in our integration test, except in this case, we're in Jest in unit test land. So I'm going to open up my terminal again and just do npm test. And we'll see Jest open. It's doing the login form, which we already fixed. And then I'm going to do run all, since it's only running what changed. So I've got some tests for the card flip. My active state for the mouse doesn't seem to be working, so I would want to fix that. Definitely more expected is that we have our keyboard mechanics that are not implemented yet. And then our accessibility API is sort of like cleaning up behind us so that we didn't have to write tests for, like, is there an anchor tag with no text in it? It's kind of nice to not have to write that test. So Xcore found that for us. That little Twitter link was just a graphic. It doesn't have any text to say this is a Twitter link. So Xcore is finding that for us. So let's do some fixes. In our card flip, we need to add a button. And with that, we need to handle the user's interaction between the normal state and the overlay state. So some focus management will be needed. Once we have that overlay open, we want to trap the user's focus so that they can't navigate behind it. So let's play with that. I'm actually going to cheat a little bit and pull out some code that I have already written. So we've got, let's see. So the tag 103, let's get this staged again. Okay, so we've got this fixed a little bit. So let's go look at the markup and how this changed. So instead of a div, we have a real button element, and it will be accessible from a keyboard perspective. So let's go back to our browser and see how this changed. So if I tab through the page now, I should be able to reach this thing. But who knows what's happening, because this is live coding, and it's an experiment. Okay, now I'm able to tab onto this thing. It might be a little buggy because this is an early preview of these components, and how often do you actually fix something in one day? So now, instead of a div, this is a real button element. I can focus on it and not just hover. So one thing that in experimenting with this element, that a choice I had to make, like a design decision, was that having, I didn't want this to show on keyboard focus. It's kind of like disruptive. If you're tabbing through a page, showing an overlay on focus is like, whoa, that's too much. So with the hover state, it was happening on hover. On focus, didn't quite make sense. And anytime you're doing one thing on hover and something else for the keyboard experience, I'm telling you right now, it's a nightmare. Trying to make things that work on hover, but what happens if you're focused and then you hover? Does it go away? Managing all that state is so complex that I decided to make the decision to just make this work on click. So it doesn't work on hover anymore. So to help the user out, I changed the text to have underlines. so that they have some cue that this is interactive, like by clicking or by using the keyboard now. So I had to make that choice. And that's probably a good takeaway to tell you when you're getting into this, is that if you're trying to do like mouse things and keyboard things and they're different, especially with like drag and drop and all that stuff, you'll end up chasing bugs and trying to iron out complexity that's often not worth it. So that's when you go back to the design team and say, hey, this hover state, like it's going to add X amount of time for me to maintain all of these interactions. Like, can we simplify? And often in accessibility, that's just the best way to go. It's better for everyone just to make it simpler. But you have to kind of give the visual cue of this is interactive from a keyboard perspective. So we've got this thing now. It works with a button. And what happens now is it's opening this overlay, and it's sending our focus into it. I added a close button so that you can actually get out of it. So if I hit enter now, I can just kind of switch back and forth between these two things. One problem, however, is that when this, if I hadn't handled trapping focus inside of this, once this overlay is open, you can get to everything behind it. So with a traditional modal overlay, that's something you definitely want to take care of. It's also, I don't know about you, but for mouse users, when they see this blue ring from like clicking on a keyboard accessible element, you're often going to have someone say, I hate that blue outline. Mouse users like just can't get past it. Even though a keyboard user needs to see where they are on the screen, a mouse user will you'll have to go to battle for focus states. So we're going to implement a fix that will actually hopefully make everyone happy by using a tool called whatInput. So let's go back to our code. We've got our button here now. It's wrapping an H5 element, which we might want to change that heading level. But that way, when a keyboard and a screen reader user, they focus on this element, because now it's not just a div. If they're in a screen reader, when they focus on this button element, it will have text in it. It has something to announce to a screen reader. This is, Rainier McChetterton's profile. I've also changed the overlay content to be in a dialogue, using a role of dialogue. You could use a dialogue element. I just make it easy, added a role of dialogue. That's also a cue for a screen reader user that there is some sort of a dialogue on the screen. And I've sort of abstracted some of that content into something that can be added into what's called a focus trap. So David Clark has written a bunch of really awesome React components, including one for a focus trap. And it's a little bit finicky, but what that does for you is prevent you from interacting with things behind this dialogue. We have to turn it on and off. So it should only be on when this modal element is open. And then when we close it, we want to remove the focus trap. So this is a lot more fixed. And I bet, we'll see what happens. But if I do npm test again, let's see if our tests are a little bit happier. Because now, let's see. Who knows what state this is in? It's part of the fun of the journey. So it is actually not happy. I don't think it's doing what it's supposed to be doing. But that's part of the exploration, is like you have to add a failing test, go try and get it to pass. So I think that's my homework, is to make sure that my tests are passing. Because you really want all this stuff to be covered, not just fixing it, but that way if your teammate comes in and they break it, that you can point to the failing tests. And having that running in your continuous integration environment, really useful. So we've added more interactive things. We've got focus management happening. So I guess I didn't really explain that. In our constructor, we're handling state. I've created 2 refs. So with focus management in React, there's this new API called createRef. It's awesome. It's way easier than it used to be. So we have 2 refs in here. We have a toggle button, which is the actual button that we added to open this thing. And then we have another ref for the close button inside of the overlay. So you can use react.createRef. And then in your markup, there's an example down here. You just say ref, and then curly brace, you point to this.close button in the case of the close button. So some things that I've added, let's see. The other button down here is the toggle button. The close button, because it's just an X, but for a screen reader user, I wanted something more descriptive. It says close Rainier McChetterton. So that close button, when a screen reader user lands on it, it'll say not only close, but something more unique. If I had a bunch of team member profiles, I would want that close button to be unique, because which one are you closing? Sort of like you can't keep track of which element you're on. And I added a click event. Instead of the hover, it now works for everyone on click. And I tried originally doing the mouse and like the keyboard experience, and it was sort of a nightmare. So that's something to watch out for. That clicking on a button, because it's a real button element, a keyboard and screen reader user can actually operate it. Okay, so we've got that going on. It's working pretty well. But that focus ring is just, I already know. I can already anticipate the GitHub issues that are going to come about if I ship it like this. That if I'm using a mouse, I can see these focus outlines. Now, there's different schools of thought for this. Like, is it still useful to have this focus indicator from the mouse? Maybe if you're doing something that's like, I don't know, it's debatable. I think for most web applications, mouse users are going to complain. So I'm going to show you a tool. It's called What Input. And we're just going to go add it in here. So I'm going to do import What Input. I've already installed it. It's a JavaScript library that will give you more affordances for for interactions. So I can be more specific in my CSS. So I've got it in here in my CSS. I can say data-what-intent, and it'll give me different hooks: mouse, keyboard, touch. And for this case, I'm going to say if it's a mouse user and they are focused anywhere in the team content div, I'm going to kill that outline. And this is nice because it only works this way if the what input library has loaded. This is a JavaScript-heavy app, so the no JavaScript case, I need to do some more work to support that. But we're not just killing outlines for everybody. We're doing it specifically for mouse users, which is kind of cool. So now that's all I had to do. I just include what input and then add some CSS. I didn't even have to touch the markup. So now if we go back to our browser and I click on this, I don't get those outlines. However, I can still focus on it. I can still, if I'm interacting with the keyboard, it's just a bit more precise. The user can be navigating in different ways, and we can style it accordingly. So in most modern web apps, you sort of need tooling like this to try and please everyone, knowing that it's sort of a fool's errand. You can't please everyone. But this is a lot better than it was before. So that's our card flip. I think we should spend a little bit more time trying to implement title changes. So the title, we can see it's got up in the title bar. I'm updating the title. The first round of this I did with a component called React Document Title, and it works pretty well at updating the title. However, a screen reader user doesn't really know what's happening. In a traditional web app, when you refresh the page, it will reset the user's focus, and the title changes so they can know that there's a new page. In a single-page app, not so much. We have to do a little more work. There are multiple strategies for this. One way would be to add focus management. So if I change my view, it could then send the focus into the main content. Because this component library thing is so simple, I'm going to implement what's called an ARIA live region in my title changes instead. So to do that, if I go back to our app.js file, this is really where we want everyone to, rather than having to implement this in every single component, we can do it at a higher level in our app.js file. So I've made a component called live region. And there's two parts to it. There is a thing called announce doc title, which is very similar to React document title, but this is specifically adding this accessibility thing. So I'm going to pull in announce doc title. I wrap my my router in my single page app with this announce doc title thing, and then each component that I want to, or each page that I want to change the title, you just wrap the content in this announce doc title. Part two of this is the actual message center that will announce to a screen reader, and this is using what's called an ARIA live region. Live regions are really great if you have things happening in your app where it doesn't make sense to move the user's focus. Like, say you have a form that the user is typing in and it's auto-saving in the background. Maybe you have some sort of toast notification off to the side for someone who can see that says, form saved or whatever. For a screen reader user, they have no idea that there's some toast notification elsewhere on the screen. I don't really want to send their focus to it because they're typing. But if I have something that I can push announcements to it, then they can keep working, and maybe in the background, in a polite way, they get this announcement of something happening. So there's different levels with ARIA Live. There's polite and assertive. Assertive is for things that they need to know about right now, like an alert or something that they need to react to right away. Whereas with polite, the screen reader will wait until the user is, whatever messages are happening have stopped announcing, then it will announce our thing. So we've got this implemented. I'm actually going to turn on a screen reader to show you how this works. So I'm going to turn on VoiceOver.
Component library window, heading level 1, visited link, component library.
How many people in here actually have ever heard a screen reader before? Okay, so lots of folks in here. So if you've got a Mac, you've got VoiceOver. I just turned it on with Command F5. If you've got an iPhone, you've got VoiceOver in your pocket. There's other tools for Windows, like NVDA and JAWS. It's good to have multiple tools. And actually, VoiceOver works best in Safari. But what it will do is it gives you tools that you can actually test this stuff. So we're just going to pay attention to these title changes and see if our component library our live region component is actually working.
Visited link, login form, list 2 items. Login form, component library has loaded. Visited link, card flip, component library has loaded.
So that's actually working. Our live region is pushing a message to that command center and saying that it's announcing that page title. Whereas if we didn't have that, you wouldn't get that page has loaded notification. So it's a lot better for a screen reader user in this simple instance that they have some context that the view has changed. And I chose that because, right now, I'm on this card flip link in the menu. The content is 1 tab away. So it would have been a little bit of overkill for me to send their focus there automatically. In a more complex app, you might consider using focus management. But you want to think about it in the context of, is a screen reader user going to be able to follow along with what's happening here? And using a live region for title changes is a good approach for simple sites. OK, so we are in way better shape now. We've implemented keyboard support. We've fixed a login form. We've used an accessibility API to catch some of this low-hanging fruit. And this is just the beginning. So hopefully, by seeing how I would debug an app, by getting some tools, there's also browser extensions like the Axe Chrome extension that can give you a checklist to just start working through. You don't need to know everything. But if you can learn some of the basics, like the required keyboard mechanics, and a great place to learn more about that is the ARIA Authoring Practices Guide. You don't need to reinvent the wheel here. But without it, we're really leaving people behind. So hopefully you've gotten some things to model over, think about. And thanks for listening to my exploratory session.